My king, Ciryon is dead and Aratan is dying. Your last counselor must advise you, nay command you, as you commanded Ohtar. Go. Take your burden, and at all cost bring it to the keepers, even at the cost of abandoning your men and me. Elendur.
The disaster of the Gladden Fields, also referred to as the Battle of the Gladden Fields, was an ambush on Isildur and his personal guard at the beginning of the Third Age. A group of orcs were dispatched by Sauron to guard the Misty Mountain passages during the War of the Last Alliance and harass any Last Alliance soldiers who attempted to cross through. In the end, Elendur and Gil-galad's forces went through that area, and the orcs fled in terror. However, when the conflict was finished, they continued to exist and wait for a force they could effectively attack. Isildur, the heir and son of Elendur, went back to Gondor following the Last Alliance's victory against Sauron. He acted as king of Arnor there as Elendilmir. He stayed for a year, establishing its boundaries and bringing it back to order. But the majority of the Arnor army eventually made their way back to Eriador along the Menorian route that runs from the Isin Fords to Fernost. When he finally made up his mind to travel back to his home world, he did so quickly because he wanted to locate his wife and youngest son Valandil in Rivendell first. He thus chose the quickest path, traveling from Osgiliath northward via the valleys of Anduin to Cirith Forn en Anrath, a steep pass that led down to Imladris. The Dúnedain army set off from Lorien in the direction of Greenwood the Great, where Thranduil was the ruler. Isildur was forced to travel the road on the steep hills on the eastern banks of the river because the flooding of the Anduin had forced them to change their course. The king's party was surrounded on the left by cliffs that overlooked the Anduin River and on the right by hills and a forest. As darkness came near, the Dúnedain were chanting marching songs and were usually in good spirits. At this moment, the lusty men heard the sound of orcs in the forested hills. Orcs from the Misty Mountains surprised them as the sun disappeared behind a cloud. They emerged from the woodland and descended the hills while roaring war cries. Although the Dúnedain could see the orcs, it was difficult to estimate their number in the low light. All that was clear was that they were vastly outnumbered by them, by 10 times or more. Isildur understood they were on there alone because Thranduil was 4 days' march ahead and Moria and Lothlorien were far behind. Isildur was unable to assemble his group into a Durnaith or wedge formation since the terrain was not level and the slope was not in his favor. He gave the order for a Vangale or shield wall to be drawn up in an effort to cut through them and cause them to flee in horror. Isildur was a man of such strength and endurance that few Dúnedain of his era could match him, and he was shielded by the Elendilmir that he carried on his brow, which the orcs feared. The orcs unleashed a volley of arrows before hurling a large number of their top warriors down the slope onto the Dúnedain, trying to breach the shield wall, but it stayed fast. The Menorian armor was unaffected by the arrows. The mighty men of Numenor towered over the highest orcs, and their swords and spears considerably outweighed their adversaries' weapons. But they were stiffened and led by terrible servants of Barad-dûr, and their attacks were crafty and merciless in their wrath. Isildur then dispatched his esquire Ohtar to transport the Narsil shards to Rivendell for safekeeping. After the initial assault, the orcs stumbled and appeared to be backing off. Many of them had been killed by the Dúnedain. In front of the Dúnedain, there were heaps of orc dead bodies. Isildur concluded that the orcs would not renew the combat after being stung so severely and instead would hunt the Dúnedain from a distance since they were acting in their customarily craven manner. The king therefore decided to move his entourage to a lower, level area, but he was incorrect. When the orcs launched their second attack, the Dúnedain had hardly traveled a mile. This time they struck with a broad front that curved into a crescent shape and quickly closed into an impenetrable ring around the Dúnedain, who lacked sufficient archers and could not be reached by even their fearsome Menorian steel bows from where the orcs were positioned. The Dúnedain were attacked with reckless brutality by the orcs as they closed in on them from all sides. Some of the larger orcs sprang in pairs, crushing a Dúnedain with their weight, dead or alive, so that other powerful claws could pull him out and kill him. Even though the orcs received 5-1 in return, they paid little. Aratan was fatally injured while attempting to help Ciryon after he was killed in this manner. The orcs gained the upper hand gradually but steadily. It became increasingly obvious that loss was coming as the struggle went on. On the east side, where the attack was most intense, Isildur was organizing the troops. He thought about using the ring to help him escape, but decided against it since it hurt too much and because he couldn't bear to leave his son. But Isildur was sought out by Elendur, who gave him the order to grab the ring and run. When Isildur put on the ring and begged Elendur for forgiveness, the unquenchable Elendur of the west suddenly erupted. Men and orcs bowed down in terror. Isildur disappeared into the darkness after drawing his cloak over his head and was never seen again. He made a long escape, and when he finally arrived at the Anduin, he desperately tried to swim across it. Even though he was strong, the tide carried him back down into the Gladden Fields, and as he swam, the ring betrayed him and fell off his finger. He was so discouraged that he almost gave up and drowned, but the feeling soon passed, and he was relieved of his heavy weight. When he emerged from the river in the moonlight and approached an islet close to the western bank, lurking orcs noticed him. They shot him with arrows out of fear for his immense height and the piercing light of the Elendur. His body was never discovered. It is thought that the river's water carried his remains away. Only 3 of the 200 Menorian knights survived. Ohtar and his companion, who delivered the shards of Narsil to Rivendell, were 2 of them. Estelmo, Elendur's esquire and one of the last to die, was the 3rd. He was stunned with a club but not killed, and was discovered alive beneath Elendur's body. The 3rd was an unidentified companion. The orcs were immediately dispersed by a relief party of woodmen, who arrived too late. Estelmo was found alive but dazed by a club blow, and he spoke of how Isildur and Elendur had discussed the One Ring before their deaths. Isildur remarked, "I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it. And I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will." It needs one greater than I know myself to be. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three.